The 4-star general went completely still after I said my call sign. For a few seconds he didn't say a word. Neither did anyone else. The ballroom noise seemed to fade into the background. The clinking glasses, the quiet conversations, the soft music coming from the far side of the room. Then General Harlan Brooks slowly pushed back his chair and stood. He looked at me. Then he looked at my husband. And in a voice calm enough to make the silence feel even heavier, he asked, "Wait, he doesn't know who you are." My husband let out a nervous laugh. I felt my stomach drop. Because in that moment I knew exactly what was about to happen. And I knew there was no stopping it. But to explain why that question hit the room like a grenade, I need to take you back a little. My name is Rachel Donovan. I'm 43 years old. I live in Colorado Springs, Colorado. For most people around town, I'm just another middle-aged woman with a dog, a mortgage, and a Costco membership. I buy groceries at King Soopers. I complain about traffic on Interstate 25. I spend way too much money at Home Depot whenever I convince myself I'm finally going to finish a project in the garage. Pretty ordinary life, at least now. But before all that, I spent nearly 2 decades flying Army helicopters, specifically UH-60 Blackhawks. And for a long time I loved every minute of it. The noise, the pressure, the responsibility, the people. Especially the people. Some of the finest men and women I've ever known sat beside me in those aircraft. The military gave me friendships that lasted longer than some marriages, including mine as it turned out. My husband Greg and I had been married for 11 years. The first 5 were good. Not perfect. Nobody's are, but good. Back then, Greg seemed genuinely proud of me. If we went to a barbecue, he'd introduce me as his wife, the helicopter pilot. If someone thanked me for my service, he'd smile. Sometimes he'd even tell stories about my career before I could. Looking back now, I think that version of Greg was real. I don't think he was pretending. I think life just changed him. Or maybe it exposed parts of him neither of us wanted to see. Greg worked in logistics management for a regional distribution company. For years he was moving upward. Good evaluations, better positions, raises, plans. Then things started stalling. A promotion went to someone younger. Then another. A company restructuring eliminated a position he had been counting on. Nothing catastrophic happened. No firing. No bankruptcy. Just years of small disappointments piling up. The kind that slowly wear grooves into a person's confidence. Around that same time I retired from the Army. People started inviting me to veterans events, military reunions, community ceremonies, mentorship programs. I never chased any of that attention. Honestly, I usually tried to avoid it. But it came anyway. And Greg noticed. At first he made little jokes. The harmless kind. Or at least that's what I told myself. If somebody asked about my service, he'd grin and say, "Don't encourage her. She already thinks she's special." Everyone would laugh, including me. Then the jokes got sharper. One afternoon I came home and found an old flight crew photograph missing from the hallway. A picture taken years earlier. My crew standing beside a Blackhawk after a long training exercise. I searched the house for 20 minutes before finding it leaning against a box in the garage. When I asked Greg about it, he shrugged. I figured guests didn't need the Rachel Donovan Museum tour every time they walked in. I remember standing there holding the frame. Not angry, just confused. The comment felt strange, like a joke missing a smile. A few months later, my old unit invited me to a reunion near Fort Carson. Nothing fancy. Just a gathering of former pilots and crew chiefs. I asked Greg if he wanted to come. He didn't even look up from his phone. No thanks. Why not? Because I don't want to spend an entire night listening to people talk about things that happened 20 years ago. I let it go. Again, that's what I did back then. I let things go. Because after a while you start convincing yourself that every marriage has rough patches. Every spouse gets insecure sometimes. Every relationship requires compromise. And maybe that's true. But compromise becomes dangerous when only one person is doing it. By the 6th year of our marriage, something else had changed. Whenever someone respected me, Greg seemed uncomfortable. Not always. Not openly. Just enough to notice. A compliment would land. Then he'd make a joke. Someone would ask about my flying career. Then he'd minimize it. Not directly. Just enough to shrink it. One 4th of July barbecue still sticks with me. A retired Marine thanked me for my service. Before I could respond, Greg jumped in. Relax. She wasn't storming beaches. Half the time she was probably pushing paperwork. Everybody laughed politely. I laughed too. But the Marine didn't. He just looked at Greg for a second, then changed the subject. That should have told me something. Instead, I ignored it. Because ignoring things was easier, at least in the short term. Then came the Gala. The annual Military Appreciation Gala held at the Broadmoor Hotel. If you've never been there, it's beautiful. Historic. Elegant. The kind of place where retired generals mingle with local business leaders and active duty officers. The kind of place where uniforms still mean something. Greg insisted we attend. The night of the event, I stood in front of our bedroom mirror adjusting my dress uniform. Most of it still fit. Not perfectly. 43 is different from 23. My knees reminded me of that every morning. My lower back reminded me every time I carried groceries. But the uniform still fit. Mostly. Then I picked up the badges. Just a handful of metal and ribbon. Nothing extraordinary. At least not to me. I stared at them for longer than I should have. For one ridiculous moment, I considered leaving them off. Not because I was ashamed. Because I was tired. Tired of hearing comments. Tired of managing Greg's feelings. Tired of pretending certain remarks didn't bother me. Then I caught my own reflection. And something inside me finally pushed back. Not dramatically. Just quietly. I had earned those badges. Every single one. Nobody handed them to me. Nobody gifted them to me. Nobody did the work for me. So I pinned them on, grabbed my purse, and headed downstairs. What I didn't know was that before the night was over, those little pieces of metal would change everything. The Broadmoor always looks like a Christmas card somebody spent $1 million creating. Even in October. The mountains sat dark against the night sky. The lake reflected strings of warm lights. Valets moved steadily through the entrance, while guests in dress uniforms and evening gowns filtered into the ballroom. I remember standing near the entrance beside Greg watching people arrive. Some faces were familiar, others weren't. A retired colonel I hadn't seen in almost 8 years waved from across the room. An old crew chief from Fort Campbell stopped me to say hello. For the first 20 minutes, everything felt normal. Good even. Greg smiled, shook hands, made small talk. The version of him I missed showed up. The version that used to make me laugh. The version that made me marry him. That's the thing about difficult relationships. The good version never completely disappears. It just shows up often enough to keep you hoping. We found our assigned table near the center of the ballroom. 8 seats. White tablecloth. Small American flag centerpiece. 2 retired officers and their wives. 1 active duty major. And us. Dinner wasn't scheduled for another half hour. Servers moved around offering drinks. Greg ordered bourbon. Nothing unusual. Then another. Still nothing unusual. I ordered sparkling water. Years of military flying had left me with a permanent distrust of feeling out of control. The conversation started naturally. Travel, grandkids, football, retirement. The major mentioned a training exercise at Fort Carson. One of the retired officers asked where I had served. Before I could answer, Greg jumped in. Rachel spent years flying helicopters. The officer nodded. That's impressive. Greg grinned. Depends who you ask. She still thinks she's Maverick. A few people chuckled politely. I smiled. The way women smile when they don't feel like explaining something. The conversation moved on. For a while. Then another round of drinks arrived. Greg leaned back in his chair. The bourbon was beginning to do what bourbon does. Not make him mean. Just louder. And more convinced that he was funny. The retired officer asked if I missed flying. I miss the people more than the aircraft, I said. That was true. The aircraft mattered. The people mattered more. Greg laughed. See, that's her way of saying she misses being the boss. Nobody laughed this time. Not because it was offensive. Because it wasn't particularly funny. The officer's wife gave me a small smile. The kind women give each other when they recognize something. The conversation shifted again. A few minutes later, another guest stopped by the table. Someone I vaguely recognized from years earlier. His eyes landed on my uniform. Rachel Wright, Blackhawk pilot. That's right. Well, thank you for your service. Before I could respond, Greg spoke. Don't encourage her. The guest laughed politely. Greg pointed toward one of my badges. I swear those things multiply every year. The man smiled awkwardly, then excused himself. As soon as he left, I felt that familiar knot forming in my stomach. Not because of what Greg said, because I already knew where the evening was heading. I've learned something about disrespect. Rarely does it arrive all at once. Usually it arrives one tiny cut at a time. A joke, a comment, a correction nobody asked for. By itself, each one seems harmless. Stack enough of them together and eventually you're bleeding. The major sitting beside me noticed it too. I could tell. He wasn't looking at Greg anymore. He was studying his water glass. People do that when they feel uncomfortable but don't want to get involved. The first flashback hit me while I was staring at my salad. A memory from 3 years earlier. I had hung an old photograph in our hallway. Nothing dramatic. Just my flight crew standing beside a Black Hawk after a long exercise. A snapshot of people who had been important to me. A week later I came home and found it gone. After searching half the house, I discovered it leaning against storage bins in the garage. When I asked Greg about it, he shrugged. I figured guests didn't need a military history lesson every time they walked in. I remembered standing there holding the frame, trying to decide whether I was hurt or simply tired. I ended up feeling both. Back in the ballroom, dinner arrived. Chicken, green beans, mashed potatoes. The usual banquet food. Not terrible. Not memorable. Greg had moved on to another bourbon. The major asked what aircraft I flew. Mostly UH-60 Blackhawks. Greg immediately jumped in. Sounds cooler than it is. I closed my eyes for half a second. Just half a second. The major glanced toward him. What do you mean? Greg laughed. People hear helicopter pilot and picture action movies. He pointed toward me with his fork. Half the time she was moving supplies training or doing paperwork. The table became very quiet. Not because what he said was entirely false. Every pilot spends time training. Every pilot spends time doing paperwork. That's reality. The problem wasn't the facts, the problem was the intention. I knew it. Everybody else knew it too. The retired officer's wife changed the subject. Bless her. She started asking about Colorado weather. The conversation recovered, but only barely. Then came another memory. 2 years earlier, my former unit invited me to a reunion. I asked Greg if he wanted to come. He didn't even pretend to consider it. I'm not spending a weekend listening to people talk about how amazing you are. The comment landed harder than he intended, or maybe exactly as hard as he intended. I never figured that part out. I went alone, had a wonderful time, and spent most of the drive home wondering why I felt guilty for enjoying myself. Back in the ballroom, dessert arrived. Cheesecake. Coffee. More drinks. The room was getting louder. Greg was getting louder too. The retired officer asked about one of the badges on my uniform. It wasn't even a particularly important one. Just a simple aviation qualification badge. Before I could answer, Greg chuckled. Honestly, some of those things